The war will end in 60 days. The US has announced exactly how they will stop the fighting. Russia is attacking Poland with drones again, and this time the capital, Warsaw, is in the crosshairs. No preconditions whatsoever. Zelensky has agreed to meet with Putin, and the half-alive Ramzan Kadyrov has made a sensational statement. My name is Alexander Prepodobny. This is the Razborka Project. Let's welcome our guest friends. Friends, please welcome Rostislav Murzagulov, a political technologist, to the Razborka Project. Rostislav, hello, we're glad to see you.
Hi, likewise, Sasha.
So here's what the US Secretary of the Treasury said. The war would have ended in 60 or 90 days if Europe had imposed sanctions on buyers of Russian oil. So it turns out the reason for ending the war has been found, as well as the tool to do it. What do you think about such a statement?
Well, Mr. Trump has come up with yet another excuse. And this excuse, if you translate it into plain language, this political bird speak, it sounds something like this. Yes, I know you're all demanding sanctions from me, and American society is demanding them too. But why are you Europeans still making money off Putin's oil? I also want to make money with him, but everyone criticizes me for it. But you aren't. So let's criticize you too. How about you do something and then maybe I'll join you? And if you don't, then I'll keep making money with him too. It's all very simple. An absolutely cynical political society, a cynical power structure. This political system, which unfortunately has been entrenched since the industrial era and still stands to this day, despite the fact that the digital age, the age of networks, when all of us will be involved in decision making, is already at the doorstep, but still can't quite get in, hesitating, knocking, and feeling shy.
Okay, so now I would like to hear what you think about another particularly noteworthy statement that was recently made by Donald Trump. He mentioned that they have an annual Yalta conference, which is an event that they hold, sometimes taking place in a virtual online format and at other times being held as an in-person offline gathering. And this time, Trump even recorded a video address for it and said that the war will not end on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. At the same time, just yesterday, he called Putin an aggressor for the first time. That is, he called Russia an aggressor in this war. But here at the negotiating table, how does he plan to negotiate? What plans do you see him having at this point?
Well, first of all, it's very good that he finally called him an aggressor. This really is the first time. And in fact, this is Trump's response to the pressure that is being put on him literally every day by the Europeans. Zelensky, who gave a pretty good interview to Sky, where he also quite carefully but firmly put some pressure on our Donald Fredovich. And that's great, first of all. Secondly, as for the negotiating table, well, in general, this is a logical development. Because in principle, if it weren't for Trump himself, then most likely, at the very least, the intensity of the war would have already decreased significantly, since Putin had already gotten scared and was ready for it. Because back when he believed that Trump was serious and that he would strangle him with this oil news through the Indian and European markets. And if you remember, in Kiev, you could sleep peacefully for about a month and a half, probably even longer. And we all hoped that this would last even longer. But then that same Trump, for some reason, started negotiating with Putin again and began discussing with him which territories Ukraine should give up. And Ukraine naturally isn't planning to give up anything, because why on earth should it do that in the first place? So basically, yes, it's clear that many of the parties involved in the war do want to see it end. In such cases, wars usually do come to an end. Often this really does happen at the negotiating table, or they end simply, so to speak, without any official announcement of the war's end. That is some kind of conditional Korean scenarios. And accordingly, this scenario could work, but only if, I'm not even talking about Ukraine right now. What is there for Ukraine to agree to? Giving up its own territories is nonsense. But if Putin's people rein in their appetites, and if Trump stops indulging these disproportionate ambitions, then of course everything will come to an end. And it will end at the negotiating table. It's hard to argue with that.
I agree with you on that. But I want to ask you something else. It seems that Zelensky might meet with Trump soon in New York. Marco Rubio reported this. And in the context of what you just said, Zelensky, as you mentioned, recently said in an interview that Putin is simply buying time, taking pictures with Trump, breaking out of international isolation, and then trying once again to deceive the American president. What do you think Zelensky will try to tell Trump? And in general, as of today, what do you think the Ukrainian administration could do to influence Trump?
If we translate Zelensky's words from diplomatic and polite language when speaking with Trump into plain, everyday language, the statement would sound something like this. Comrade Trump, you're not doing a damn thing. You keep bargaining with Putin, even though you have all the means to end this quickly. And we've already seen that Putin is actually afraid of you. That's what Vladimir Alexander said. And accordingly, this event you mentioned is actually quite important. This is what my American colleagues simply call UN Week. They look forward to it every year with interest because all the parties involved in every complex situation on planet Earth gather there. And it's this kind of melting pot where, roughly speaking, it becomes clear who can come to an agreement with whom and about what. And that's why during this UN week, it's not just a Trump-Zelensky meeting that could happen. I'm almost certain it will happen because right now Trump needs, in some way, to somehow fit all of this into a single narrative and still show some progress to his people, because even he himself has been forced to admit that this ended in his failure. He even called himself a disaster. And for Trump, as someone who loves to boast, that was of course difficult. I think not easy at all. So the fact that he said this, and the fact that there are already leaks about this meeting possibly taking place, and the leaks aren't just coming through the media, but through Marco Rubio. That's a serious source. He's someone who usually knows what's really going on. He was almost the president of America, by the way. But anyway, that's just my wishful thinking. So basically, we're really waiting for the 20th, waiting for the start of UN week. And there won't be any real breakthroughs there. The war won't end there. Let's not mislead the audience. But there might be some trends that we as observers can pick up on. Trends that show which direction things are really heading and what and with whom people are willing to agree.
Yes, for example, I'm reading a statement from Zelensky again from this interview, where he says that decisive measures must be taken to stop Putin, among other things. I just want to understand what real tools does the US actually have right now to, on the one hand, do this, and on the other hand, fulfill, well, as they say in that probably unprintable joke. Because last week, statements were made at the White House, I think it was either J.D. Vance or Marco Rubio, that there is no goal to economically isolate Russia. If Russia stops shooting, then they want to cooperate with it economically. Today, for example, it's being said that there will be a meeting with Zelensky. How can all of this fit together? And Zelensky, for his part, is demanding economic measures against Russia. So how can all of this be reconciled?
Because Zelensky has already seen that in reality, when Trump really needs to scare Putin and force him to do something, Putin gets scared and does something. Because we all saw when Trump decided to influence India and Europe so that India would buy less Putin's oil and Europeans accordingly would buy less gasoline made from Putin's oil. And both sides were perfectly financing the war in Ukraine. At the same time, they kept patting Ukraine on the back and saying how concerned they were about the ongoing war. And now we see that suddenly all of this has stopped working because Trump and Putin had some kind of conversation. And most likely Trump promised him something again. And that's why Zelensky is simply trying to bring this gentleman back to his senses and say to him, Comrade, you showed us what you can do, but why aren't you doing what you already started doing?
Yes, it's important to note that Europe has imposed 18 packages of sanctions against Russia. This is the same Europe that Trump is now blaming for not stopping the war, supposedly for financing the Kremlin's budget. However, we haven't seen any truly decisive new packages from the United States in a very long time. So, what do you think about Lindsey Graham's package, which has been gathering dust for quite a while now, and we haven't even mentioned Lindsey Graham for about 2 months? It's as if he's just been cut out of the agenda, right? And let me remind you, this is the man who promised crushing sanctions against the Russian oil industry. Is there a chance they might bring him back from the sidelines and actually implement something? Because it seems like it just stayed as a scare tactic.
Yes, it really did just remain a scare tactic, but actually that scare tactic was quite effective because in fact it set the course for the whole story. When Trump was putting pressure on India, when the Indian minister got scared and started telling everyone that they would easily take oil back from the Arab countries they used to buy it from and from Latin America as well. Accordingly, there's really no point in digging up that forgotten dirty little package now because basically everyone understands that whether it's 50% sanctions or 100% or even 500% sanctions, as was mentioned in that package, it doesn't actually make much of a difference. The only difference is that in reality, aside from that number itself, which looks intimidating, there are actually a lot of different mechanisms involved. On one hand, there's pressure on India to stop buying oil from Putin and to start sourcing it elsewhere. On the other hand, this can't be solved by pressure alone. India is, in fact, willing to work with America and trade with America. We've heard about this many times and have seen it for ourselves. But India needs to be offered something in return. And so when there was likely that situation where Putin got scared and reduced the intensity of military actions, most likely Putin did something like, My God, for some reason, I often slip up and call Trump Putin, and not without reason. And so at that point, Trump obviously promised the Indians something that appealed to them. And that's when Putin rushed over to the Washington Regional Committee to Alaska. And now, roughly speaking, Zelensky is trying to steer everyone back into that same direction. How about you stop pretending to be busy and instead put real pressure on India so that it agrees to stop supporting Putin? And promise India something so that it stops supporting Putin. Because in a way, this door has two keys. One is the carrot, the other is the stick. So give both to the Indians so that Putin really gets scared again. That's what Zelensky is demanding, as well as the rest of progressive humanity.
Yes, on the one hand, I completely understand what you're saying, but on the other hand, I'm reading a statement from the Times, and they claim, again, that 65 Indian military personnel are currently participating in this collaboration between Belarusians and Russians. Zapad 2025. These are the very exercises because of which Poland closed the border. They're taking place right now. There are 30,000 military personnel participating and 600 pieces of military equipment. These are approximate figures. So, Sasha, just to make sure we're all on the same page and to be perfectly clear, we are definitely including them as well. Is that correct?
Yes, the Americans came too.
Well, you see, it just seems to me that they came with the Indians for different reasons. The Americans are there so that, well, if anything happens, they can immediately shoot or report what's going on to the nearest NATO general staff.
They actually came with a single purpose. Both delegations came to strengthen their negotiating positions, specifically with each other. India with America, America with India.
Okay, wait, I just haven't seen this news. So, are the Americans representing a military contingent or a diplomatic one?
The American military told Lukashenko, "We want to come and see what kind of exercises you have going on." They said, "Go ahead, there are no secrets, come over."
Okay, well, yes. As I understand from this news, it's specifically 65 military personnel who will be involved.
Well, 65 soldiers is nothing. It's most likely just an observation group and a way to put pressure on the outside world, like, look, we're keeping an eye on things. Should we maybe start seriously helping Lukashenko and Putin at some point? But India will never do that because for them this is not a decisive or critical market, whereas America is critical.
That's a super point. So let's establish the fact that the writers at the Times, and I'm correcting myself from my initial thought of Sky News, are truly masters of crafting headlines. They have an undeniable talent for it, and I must admit that I personally fell for this specific one. It was incredibly effective at grabbing my attention. Okay, I fully understand the situation now. Let's continue talking about this region. In Poland, a drone was shot down just a few hours ago, as reported by Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland. But the question is, this drone was already flying over the government building, right in Warsaw. To be precise, I'm translating from Ukrainian here. Recently, the State Security Service neutralized a drone that was directly flying over the government district and, in fact, the Belvedere Palace, where foreign delegations are usually received. 2 Belarusian citizens were detained. Am I right in understanding that now Russian intelligence agencies, through their Belarusian proxies, are going to troll Poland to the fullest with these kinds of military actions?
You know, when I saw this news, I was really glad because I decided to listen carefully to the next anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian statements from this gentleman, the new president of Poland, a populist and an idiot, who said things like, "Why do we need Ukraine? Russia is fine, let's work with everyone." Well, now let him talk about it when something was flying over his head that could just as easily come down right on him. So basically, that's my comment on this topic because, well, all normal, reasonable people understand in all reasonable countries around the world that Russia is the aggressor, that it will stop at nothing, and that it will continue its attempts at expansion for many years to come if it is not stopped right now. And those who still didn't understand this will probably start to understand more after incidents like these. There have been completely brazen, unfriendly actions from the Russians, from Russia. It will keep trying endlessly, using this aggression, these acts, to force Europe into peace on its own terms, because that's the calculation that Putin and his circle have made. They think that now, by scaring Europe, they'll make it so that nothing at all can be given to Ukraine anymore, because Putin is already getting closer to us. Well, let's see how the public reacts. I think, after all, the reaction will be a general increase in hatred toward the Putin regime and a desire to help their leaders remove this regime as soon as possible, and to help Ukraine resist this regime as quickly as possible.
There is some interesting data about how long and how many Ukrainians are willing to keep fighting, and you could say to endure the war. I don't want to use the word endure. I think that's not the right wording, because probably that's only applicable to those who are at least closer to the front line. 62% of Ukrainians are ready to remain in a state of war for as long as it takes for it to end on acceptable terms. These are the latest results published by KIIS, the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. What do you think about this? Is this what the Kremlin was counting on at all? After all, as I understand it, they're actively working not only on military operations, but also on launching psychological operations in Ukraine. Are they satisfied with these kinds of results? Do they see any kind of trend in this?
You know, the Kremlin's so hopeless at strategy that very often they declare something and the exact opposite ends up happening. And this is exactly one of those situations when they thought that with their terrorist attacks, these insane and numerous ones, and accordingly, what's particularly interesting to consider is what is actually happening on the ground inside Russia itself. And what's more, even the Kremlin's own court sociologists are already reporting findings that show that only a mere 27% of the Russian population actually supports the war. And at the same time, these court sociologists don't mention the percentage of people who refuse to participate in the surveys. And in various polls during this war, the refusal rate has been 80 to 90%. So roughly speaking, out of 10 to 20% of Russians, 27% support the war. We understand that those who refuse to participate in the surveys most likely don't support it either, or at the very least are more likely not to support it, because, well, it's obvious that otherwise they wouldn't refuse to take part in the surveys. And that's why we have the opposite situation. Russia's tired of the war, Russia doesn't want to endure it any longer, and the Ukrainians who were unjustly attacked and are facing atrocities, naturally, as normal people, as a strong civil society, as a united nation, want to preserve all of this, their nation and their country. And basically, as always in Russia, what they fought for is what they ended up with.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
To our audience, I want to say that in just a couple of minutes we'll be discussing a very interesting topic. How Kadyrov started threatening Alla Pugacheva after her sensational interview. Let me remind you that Alla Borisovna spoke favorably about the head of the Chechen Republic in the 90s, well, during the period before the First Chechen War, Dzhokhar Dudayev, whom Kadyrov hates. And in fact, it seems they even filed a lawsuit against her because of all this. We'll also discuss the orders and medals awarded to Kadyrov's son. But to wrap up this segment, I want to ask you, what is the purpose? What exactly is Yulia Navalnaya, the wife of the late Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny, doing? Why am I asking this question in this way? Let me explain. She recently stated that it's very important to understand that Putin is not Russia, that Russian citizens are not to blame for the war, and therefore tourist visas for Russian citizens who want to travel to the European Union should not be cancelled. And my question is this really the main issue right now, the one that should stop the war? Or am I missing something?
Well, I am deeply convinced that the FBK is what you might call a police-controlled organization, that from time to time they carry out assignments that come to them from various, let's say, interesting entities. They have been repeatedly caught interacting with various Putin loyalists, and Maria Pevchik has certain close ties with Comrade Dugin, one of the ideologists of the Russian world. There's a video about this on my channel, you can check it out. And I have not the slightest doubt that it's not Yulia Navalnaya who is in charge there. She is currently just the public face of this so-called opposition organization. The ones really running things are still Ms. Pevchik and Mr. Volkov, who have been repeatedly caught red-handed collaborating with the Kremlin, the Lubyanka, or others like them. And accordingly, what they are doing now, of course, outrages me to the limit as well, because what are we even talking about here? Over the past year, 500,000 Russians have gone to Europe for vacation. Is that good or bad? Let's figure it out. From my point of view, as someone who is also an immigrant and lives in Ukraine and can sometimes visit Europe, of course, it would be great for me if, for example, my people who live in Russia and are kind of covertly anti-war could travel to Europe so that I could meet up with them there. But obviously, this same situation is also used by numerous Putin agents who can easily blend into this crowd. Yes, of course, someone will probably object now that if Putin needs to send Mishkin and Chapiga, say, to Germany to kill someone there again, then most likely he will give them diplomatic passports, Belarusian passports, or passports from some other country friendly to Putin, and that they will get there anyway. But when just two of them arrive there, it will be easy to catch them, intercept them, and expose them. but when they travel among crowds of hundreds of thousands of tourists, it becomes quite difficult for European intelligence services to single out where are those very agents who are coming to Europe to kill, to stage provocations, to organize explosions at defense enterprises, of which they have already carried out quite a few. And then there's also a second, more moral aspect to consider. And out of these 500,000 Russians who have visited Europe, did all of them really deserve such a privilege? This raises a direct question, and this question was also raised by the Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which has every right to ask it. And we all understand perfectly well that among this crowd, most likely a significant portion, maybe even the majority, are people who support Putin, who support the war. And the fact that they are being allowed in is in essence a legitimization of the war, a legitimization of Putin once again, and yet another acknowledgement of Putin's supposed correctness. Because really, how else can you interpret it? So people who support Putin and the war come to Europe, and they are welcomed there with open arms. Hello, dear friend, make yourself at home, feel free to settle in. And this is exactly what should not be allowed to happen. I believe that the only way a Russian citizen should be allowed to visit Europe, to visit the European Union, is only after they have signed, just as I have, for example, an anti-war declaration, which explicitly states that Putin is a war criminal, that Ukraine is not at fault for anything, and that there were no reasons whatsoever for the madness that Russia, unleashed in the heart of Europe. And accordingly, people like that probably can, and in fact probably should have the opportunity to leave Russia. Moreover, they should probably even be given the chance to take some assets with them so that the outflow of capital from Russia increases. But as for ordinary tourists, whom Yulia Navalnaya is so concerned about, supposedly relying on the presumption of innocence, the presumption of innocence does not work during wartime. By that logic, well, then we should let all Russians into Ukraine. Is that how it works? Well, after all, they probably don't all support Putin and the war. Let's let everyone into Kyiv. Let them walk around here, carry out terrorist attacks right inside. Is that it? So basically, that's why, of course, Yulia Navalnaya, as they say, got caught once again, simply repeating all the talking points that just a couple of days before her were voiced by comrade Maria Zakharova. Everything about her is clear and simple.
Well, yes, it's a bit strange when people who support the war come to countries that their own country is supposedly at war with. At least that's what Russian propaganda keeps saying, including Solovyov, who talks about carpet bombing Kharkiv and bombing various factories and enterprises on the territory of Warsaw and other countries. It's a little bit weird. I agree. Let's talk about something else. A huge interview with Alla Pugacheva was released. We won't be analyzing it. Of course, anyone who wants to can watch it. If you don't want to, please watch our broadcast instead. We don't mind. But there was a remarkable story in it. Alla Borisovna mentioned Dzhokhar Dudayev, and if my memory is serving me correctly, she went on to characterize him as a fundamentally good and even a great person, describing him as intelligent, kind, and all that sort of thing. And right then, Kadyrov got incredibly worked up about it. He even called for her to be declared an enemy of the people, Alla Borisovna Pugacheva. So Ramzan Kadyrov called Alla Pugacheva an enemy of the people because she called Dzhokhar Dudayev a decent person, and even urged Pugacheva not to provoke the Chechens. That's how he reacted to the interview in which she spoke favorably about the leader of the Chechen separatists at that time. And what do you think? By the way, there's even a lawsuit filed against Alla Pugacheva by one of the characters who monitors bloggers and wild parties. He also wants to open a criminal case against her. Why did Kadyrov react that way? Is that his personal opinion, or does he have to act that way? Please comment on this situation.
Well, the fact that the Russian authorities launched such a massive campaign to vilify Alla Pugacheva because of that interview is, of course, quite something. This shows that they are completely clueless there. They have no idea what to do in different situations. And once again, they're basically shooting themselves in the foot because they're going to get exactly the opposite result from what they were aiming for. The thing is, when Pugacheva gave that interview with numerous political statements and a very clear assessment that war is bad, that Ukraine is an innocent country, that the authorities in Russia are doing everything wrong, that there are a lot of scoundrels in Russia who are now engaged in informing and denunciations, turning everything back into the situation that existed under Stalin when Pugacheva was born. And that once again, it has become shameful to be Russian and to speak Russian in respectable countries around the world. This is in fact an interview that is very, very significant, despite the fact that many of my friends in Ukraine believe that Pugacheva didn't actually say anything particularly harsh about Putin in that interview. But that's precisely where the strength of this interview lies. Because this interview resonated with about 90% of those Russians who never react to the war in any way, who pretend it doesn't exist at all. And since everyone knows Pugacheva, regardless of how they feel about her, whether they love her, dislike her, listen to her or not, they definitely checked out what exactly she said and heard all the points I mentioned earlier. Absolutely anti-Putin, anti-war, and pro-Ukrainian points. And that's really great, of course. And what's really cool is that this clumsy Russian government itself is giving a new reason for this news story to keep going and to make a few more rounds across Russia among those same 90% of Russians who make up this aggressively obedient majority and who usually aren't interested in politics. In other words, it got everyone interested in politics. And this government, which started to vilify her, is only fueling the fire, and that's wonderful. 25 million views, that's just on Gordiva's own channel, the one who did the interview. Plus, countless quotes on several thousand media channels. So this really is 90% coverage of Russia. And now what they've started, like Borodin with this lawsuit, these statements from channels like Tsargrad saying that a criminal case should be opened and Pugacheva should be put in prison for 10 years. Numerous statements that she urgently needs to be labeled a foreign agent. So they're the ones creating.
Let me add, Rostislav, let me add that there's another figure. His name is Alexander Treshev. As a lawyer who is well known for constantly popping up on talk shows, he is now seeking to fine Pugacheva the sum of 1.5 billion rubles for these specific statements as well.
Plus, really, this madness about fining Pugacheva 1.5 billion. They're actually building a bridge themselves between those who aren't interested in politics and those Russians who are, and who make these anti-war, anti-Putin assessments. And that's why it's really impressive that at the same time, they brought this campaign in and gave the order to go after either to Kadyrov or to the person who's basically ruling in Kadyrov's place now, because Kadyrov is in very bad shape. They say he's already walking around with a urine bag, and in situations like that, he doesn't have time to react to someone like Pugacheva. And accordingly, the fact that Kadyrov was included in this campaign is really great, because in reality, Russia can't stand Kadyrov. Kadyrov and everything associated with him, because it's lawlessness across the whole country, because it's a way of life completely outside any Russian laws or rules whatsoever. And that's why the fact that Kadyrov is now starting to trample on Pugacheva is actually very good. This is exactly that dividing line, that agitation that often begins in different countries with seemingly harmless things. And here it would seem it's just an interview with some singer who hasn't even performed concerts for a long time. But this has stirred up Russia. Today, people who have no idea what politics is, what a VPN is, what YouTube is, and who generally just say, well, it's blocked and that's that, are talking about politics. But in reality, even many people who haven't used any of that stuff for a long time, who aren't involved in politics, who don't read the news, have reached out to me directly and asked, hey, I heard Pugacheva made some powerful statement. Where can I read about it? And that's why, in fact, the Russian authorities are amplifying this signal many times over by involving figures like Kadyrov. Well, let them have at it. More power to them.
Since we've mentioned Kadyrov, by the way, let me remind you that the underage son of the head of Chechnya was found to have a watch worth 41 million rubles. Yeah, that's the kind of price we're talking about. The brand is called Jacob & Co. I can't seem to find the model here, but that's not the point. Well, none of this is being hidden at all. All of this is done to show off on Instagram, including his sister showing off the watch. It's decorated with 104 diamonds. Only 18 of these pieces exist in the world. Naturally, Kadyrov was called out for this. But Kadyrov seems to have hinted that he doesn't mind his son wearing such a watch because, well, the most important thing is how he works. What do you think about this?
Well, actually, we often talk about how we're living at the end of the industrial age and how we wish the digital era would come sooner. But if you look at Kadyrov, he hasn't even reached the industrial age yet, and most likely he'll die before it ever arrives in Chechnya. Because in Chechnya, society is still at the primitive communal stage. And there, beads are very important. Just like in primitive societies, various chiefs would adorn themselves with beads to physically distinguish themselves from those who didn't have any. It's amazing, but that's really how it is. And that's a distinguishing sign that you're cool, that you're powerful, that you've achieved a lot, that you've grabbed all the resources for yourself. And because of that, you're considered a real success, and no one can argue with you because you're big and scary and could tear everyone apart into 1,000 little bear cubs. And within all of this, in fact, Kadyrov, both the younger and the elder for quite some time now, are being decorated with all these medals, adorned with fancy watches, luxury cars, and things like that. This is done so that Chechen society doesn't even think of rebelling, so that it understands that he is the main future leader. And Kadyrov has practically already stated that just as he himself has gone through this brilliant path, now Adam is following the same path. And that's why everything is for him. Everyone must lie down, stay silent, and bow twice, even at the mere sight of his watch coming around the corner, not even his whole self yet.
Listen, so what are your predictions? because it's so obvious that he's creating an image of his son as his successor that you don't even need any expertise here. I just want to ask you about the timing, or maybe about some main trigger. Is it only Kadyrov's death that could put his son on the throne? He says, I grew up next to my father, was always by his side and learned a lot. Adam also grew up next to me. He already has a wealth of experience and knowledge. He has practical experience too. When I was appointed Deputy Prime Minister, I was also young, but Vladimir Vladimirovich trusted me with this position. Is he now begging Putin to grant his son that same trust? So is this like a presentation, a performance for him, or what?
Yes, of course, this performance is for Putin. But in reality, of course, no one is going to fire the terminally ill Kadyrov, because a terminally ill Kadyrov who hasn't caught any mice in a long time suits everyone just fine. He suits, first and foremost, Putin's generals, who hate Kadyrov just as much as the rest of Russia does. And when he's sick and not really doing much, and there are plenty of different representatives of the Chechen elite around him with whom you can make deals, well, that's actually pretty convenient for everyone. And as for what will happen when Kadyrov dies, in reality, there's absolutely no guarantee that things will go the way Kadyrov wanted while he was alive. Because first of all, even if Putin promised something and signed it in blood, those promises are worth exactly 0 rubles and 0 kopecks, because Putin is a swindler. But frankly speaking, if Kadyrov is really counting on the fact that with these 15 weddings of his, marrying his relatives to the relatives of all the major Russian clans, he has somehow secured the extension of power for his family, then that's certainly very naive. I think that all those numerous members of the Kadyrov family who have become related to him in this way, as soon as Putin comes to them and offers something else, something more lucrative and more reliable in terms of prospects, they will all gladly betray Kadyrov's shadow and his legacy.
I hope we see that day as soon as possible. We'll be rooting for all the teams, as they say. Thank you very much. Rostislav Murzagulov, political strategist, was on the air for the Razborka project. All the best to you. Glad to see you.
Take care. Likewise.